Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Motivating Workplaces Post-Pandemic Workshop with Kaylee Switzer, brought to you by Hire for Talent, a national awareness campaign aimed at increasing employer confidence in hiring people with disabilities and providing resources to help employers tap into this talent pool during their search for skilled employees. My name is Caitlin Woods, and I am a project agent at the CBDC Restigouche, and I am representing Hire for Talent. I would like to thank you all so much for joining us today from the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq First Nation, on which we are learning, working, and playing. So before we begin, I would just like to quickly go over some housekeeping to help everyone enjoy today's session to the fullest. We're happy to provide simultaneous translation for this session from English to French. You can select your preferred language at the bottom menu. Closed captioning can also be enabled in your bottom menu bar, and we would like to ask that everyone remains on mute until the end of this session, but we will have a question and answer period. Today, we are discussing a topic that has likely affected all of us, our employees, or someone we know, lacking motivation in the workplace. In this session, you will learn why your employees might be feeling this way and how you can better motivate your team through transition. Kaylee will talk about the brain science behind languishing, how it has been affecting the workplace, and what we can do to help our employees to feel more joyful, engaged, and energized. I am pleased to present today's speaker, Kaylee Switzer, a counseling therapist and a personal development coach. She helps people reduce anxiety, foster self-compassion, gain clarity, and move in the direction of what matters to them. Kaylee has a BA in educational psychology from Mount Allison University, a BEd in teaching from St. Thomas University, and a Master of Education in Counseling from Harvard University. So without further ado, I will pass it over to you, Kaylee.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I am going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Well, I can't see any of your faces, but okay, great. Yeah, you said, Caitlin says you can. So as Caitlin said, my name is Kaylee, and we're going to talk about post-pandemic motivation, and I hope it will be helpful to you. I grew up in Charlottetown, PEI. I did my undergrad at Mount Aish. I won't go through that. I went to school on the East Coast for most of my time. Then I moved to Toronto and I worked with youth leadership programming for a while. And then I went back to school to do my master's at Harvard. And then I moved to Los Angeles and I was teaching kindergarten for a few years and then decided to start my business. And so the work I do now is in private practice as a counseling therapist. I moved back to PEI when I was pregnant with my first daughter. So I've been here 4 years now. And half of my work is like counseling therapy, and the other half is coaching. And it's mostly helping people with time management and organization. So no matter what, if I'm doing coaching work or counseling work, I'm just trying to help people increase their capacity to experience calm and ease in their life and to feel more intentional in how they spend their time. So in other words, if we know what your values are, then helping you align your time with your values and not feeling too much like you're in a rat race. So this is the topic for today. We're going to talk about languishing, which is just a big word that is being used a lot in talking about the effects of the pandemic on morale and just like personal motivation. And we're going to talk about why it's happening, the context that's created this, and things that help in workplaces and personally as well. So languishing is it just means not mental illness, but the lack of mental wellness. So I love this quote because I feel like it summarizes it. It wasn't burnout. We still had energy. It wasn't depression. We didn't feel hopeless. We just felt somewhat joyless and aimless. And it turns out there's a name for that. Languishing. And so languishing is not new. It's not like it was invented because of the pandemic. It's been talked about before, but it's the first time that we have felt like the entire world is sort of feeling it at the same time. And it's just this sort of like meh feeling that a lot of us are like, when you say it that way, yeah, I see what you mean. That's like, maybe that's part of what's been going on. It's emptiness, stagnation, ennui, monotony, looking at life through foggy windshield, and having trouble concentrating. Admit, there we go. Oh, got some joiners. Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's very exciting when the doorbell rings, I find. Okay. So we think of it as the middle child of mental health. So on one end, we have depression. We know about that. And then the other end, we have flourishing, which is like, woohoo, that's where we want to be. Hello. Okay. And in the middle, we have languishing. So I can't get over that. Sorry. I just love the doorbell sound. All right. Depression is when we feel despondent, drained, and worthless. It's like the lowest of low. And languishing is better than that. It's not so low, but we're not exactly the picture of mental health. You're not functioning at full capacity. You're feeling like your motivation is lower. Your focus is not as strong as usual, and it triples the odds of come back to work. So what it looks like, and this is may notice in yourself or other coworkers or employees, it's just an overall feeling of disconnection or being disassociated from your coworkers more than usual, being more irritable, more confused or sad than usual, an inability to get excited about upcoming projects. I see that one a lot, like a sort of like a loss of hope, almost like being having a harder time focusing or remembering, more cynicism about your leaders, colleagues, or career, and more procrastination or lack of motivation to complete assignments. That's the biggest one, I think, that I've seen. In a personal life, it's overall a sense of emptiness or existential crisis, just an absence of well-being, even though you're not sick, an inability to describe your feelings, and feeling as though there's not as much to look forward to as usual, maybe even engaging in more risky behaviors to try and break that blah feeling. And the interesting thing about it is because it's been going on for so long and we've had some kind of ebbs and flows within it, it's almost like because of that, we almost don't even know that we're functioning on more of a low level than usual because it's just been normal going through the motions. So something that like a little self-assessment can be engaging in something like revenge bedtime procrastination, where we're just, for some reason, even though we know it's going to make tomorrow worse, staying up later, doing nothing on the internet, almost like to get back at something. Like it's almost like let's create something good in our life. Like it's this weird dynamic that most people are like, I do know I have a tendency to do that sometimes. Languishing is not the same as burnout. Burnout is when we're talking about work specifically, and it's when we have a poor work-life balance or doing work that's not a good match for our values and skills. But languishing is more global. It's an overall like emotional state. So it affects work and it affects every area of our life. And you can move in and out of languishing. It's not like I'm languishing and then I'm done languishing. It's more like I'm languishing today and then it can come and go. It's most concerning when we get stuck in it and we don't know how to get ourselves out, because it's the kind of emotion that is so hard to see or notice in ourselves that it can easily slip or slide into a more serious condition. So it's just something we want to develop more of we want to identify when it's happening so that we can start to do some of the things at that time to get ourselves feeling a little less like we're languishing. Because when we start sliding lower, like to depression, it's harder to do the things we know would help. We lack, it makes it much more difficult to put those tools into place, even if we know what they are. So we know depression is a clinical condition. It's much more severe. It is also going to extend into all aspects of life, but it doesn't come and go. And it must last at least 6 months to be diagnosed, and it requires professional help to treat it. So languishing is super duper sneaky. It is the kind of thing that it's an absence of emotion. So it's a lot harder to see because we're just like, it's almost as if we forget the difference. Like we might be like, I think I used to feel more joyful than this, but it's hard to know for sure. It's not that severe. It's subtle. But it is a lingering emotional state. So the key feature is that we almost can't realize we're in it. It's not a dramatic feeling. So sometimes we miss just how far below our potential we're existing. And I think that's really powerful. The example I like to share is I work with someone who is a high school band teacher. And so a big part of the joy of her job is concerts, like band concerts. But for the last few years, she hasn't been able to do them in the typical, like the conventional way that she always has. And this year she was able to. And it was that moment of all of their effort of the entire year coming together, the students looking around at one another, being like that magic moment of like, we created this, and her witnessing that. And that gives her so much meaning in her role. But she said, like, it's only been a few years. That's something she had done for 15 years up to that point, and she didn't realize how much she was missing it, because until she had it back, she couldn't quite connect to how big the loss actually was. That's a really good example. So on one hand, we don't recognize our condition. On the other, many people don't know they have the power to improve their condition, because languishing is one of those things that, like, the context does justify it. Like, it's not hard to look around and be like, seems, yep, that makes sense. Like, there's a lot of reasons to justify languishing. It's not like it's a bad thing, but if we can acknowledge when we're in it, there are things we can do to improve how we're feeling, even just feel empowered knowing that it's not something we have no control over, and that can help. Places where conversations about well-being aren't common make it especially tough. So if you are in a culture, whether a work culture, a family culture, or just community culture, where people don't really talk about how they're feeling, languishing is one of those ones that really tends to not get addressed, because many people feel like if they're not in crisis, there's no real point in talking about how you're doing. It's almost like other people have it worse. Who am I to be complaining? And then we tend to, we think that is like helping our feelings, but our feelings really don't like being told they're invalid. So when we shove it down in that way, it doesn't disappear. It just stays there and then comes out in other ways. So it can be as simple as just naming, like there's an expression, name it to tame it. Just naming how we're actually doing can give permission to other people to name how they're actually doing. And that it's not like dwelling on the negative, it's more being honest and helping people feel less alone. And if we know how we're feeling, we can move from that honest point as opposed to kind of ignoring it inside of ourselves. And it's important to identify it, because we know that people who are left languishing for a long time are more likely to slide into that serious mental illness, like PTSD, anxiety, major depression. So we don't want that. I think this is so interesting. So there's this study that was done in 2018 by a group of psychologists who went to the Antarctic, and people have been talking about how this study is relevant to our current condition. It's the idea that when they studied all these people who went to the Antarctic, they found that their emotional capacity had been significantly reduced just in the time they'd been there. The participants living in the Antarctic reported feeling duller than usual and less lively. And then in the report, they called the condition psychological hibernation. And I think, yes, this is something many of us can relate to now. That's such a good term. Summer can help sometimes, like almost a feeling of, am I emerging from hibernation? But in general, there is this like mutedness to life. We know the brain is only wired to function optimally under short bursts of stress, like performance, test, deadline. We're wired to adapt to that. But when a bit of daily anxiety becomes a chronic stress level, the body begins to break down and we become emotionally exhausted. So we have not been having just short bursts of stress when it comes to this. There's a kind of constant baseline level of stress that, if you think about how that's going to impact people over time, it's going to create this emotional exhaustion. So when our brains and bodies are already fatigued, which we can assume ours are, most people, recalibrating to changing new circumstances becomes too much. There's so much the pivoting and the we're opening, we're closing, all of that we've gone through is a lot to recalibrate to, especially when it's something brand new. There's a term we use called surge capacity, which is when all of our adaptive systems that come together, we use those to survive acutely stressful situations. So in other words, like if you're in an acutely stressful situation, like a car accident, then our bodies are designed to adapt mentally and physically to survive that situation. It's amazing. But the key word is it's short-term survival. We're not supposed to be using surge capacity just all the time. It's not designed to last for years. And when we try to use it too much, we are completely exhausted. And then we're confused why we're completely exhausted, because like in many ways, it doesn't really feel like we're in an acutely stressful situation, like no tiger, not starving, like not under super intense physical threat right now. And yet, why am I so exhausted? And how much have we just normalized a certain level of this because we've had it for so long? We have been sprinting for a marathon. Eventually, we have been depleting our nervous systems and we need a break to recharge. And early in the pandemic days, it seemed as though we would get an it's over day, like, woohoo, we did it, it's done, let's go, be free. But that moment vanished. And it's natural for humans. We like cohesive and coherent narratives. We like things to make sense, like a beginning, middle, end. It's very difficult to have more of the story be like, well, we'll see, like, just going to live with it, I guess. That is hard for us. And it's hard to not feel like we're going to get a clearly demarcated fresh start. Pandemic flex syndrome is another big term I learned about in the research. It's the emotional ups and downs of the pandemic. It's like emotional whiplash. One of the things the brain tries to help us do in stressful situations is use emotional regulation. So in other words, it's like when we're stressed about something, we use our emotional regulation skills inside of our brain to talk ourselves down. This is like using the decision-making part of our brain to calm down the emotional or limbic system. We're able to do it, it's wonderful, but it takes a lot of cognitive energy. And when we're in an ongoing threat situation where we're constantly thinking about like pro-con grocery store, like, should I going to this wedding, going to this event, traveling, like when there's this extra layer to everything, our brain stays in survival mode in a sense. This was probably my favorite line that I learned of all the research. Life is both too overwhelming and not engaging enough. I think about this all the time. I think that is so true. I don't know if that resonates with anyone else, but it's like, on some level, life has just been so overwhelming in a way that we just have to function through it. So we're not really even aware of how overwhelming it is because it's just how it is. But it's also not engaging enough because there's a limit to so many things. And we've also just had to make that be okay. So we're always doing this 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. Like, woohoo, people aren't having this severe reactions to this variant. Oh, new variant, just kidding, everything's worse. Like it's this forward backward dance that is like, whiplash, pandemic flex. There's been comparisons to what's going on to combat soldiers, like the research that's been done historically on combat soldiers and what we tend to see happen as their progression emotionally through a combat experience. So they talk about how there is, when there's the initial acute emergency, then that surge capacity that we were talking about, the adrenaline, all of our adaptive systems come into place. And this is when we transcend our differences, we come together, we have a shared sense of what we're fighting. This is like early days pandemic lockdown mode, like, who we're like not happy about it, but at least we're in it together. There was some sort of shared humanity in the whole thing. And we see this in combat research, like on that when that acute emergency phase happens, teams function really, really well. But after the battle, when there's less to do, that's when teams start to fall apart. And I think a lot of people I've worked with anyway have noticed that in their own workplaces, that metaphorical battle is done. And then we start to see the falling apart. So this is in combat research, they call this regression, or the regression phase. It's when people start to feel powerless and start to shut down, losing our personal power, feeling a sense of less choice. And we know that when people feel out of control, we tend toward anxiety or depression. People can experience both, but even if we have never had maybe a diagnosis for anxiety or depression, we still are internally going to have a predisposition to like tend in one direction, more anxiety type symptoms or more depressive type symptoms. So when you feel powerless and out of control, some of us tend towards anxiety, where we just want to drastically change something about our lives. That'd be me. Be like, who wants to cut bangs? Who wants to move? Like, it's very much like time for something big and that I can control, and I'm making it happen. And let's just get some new paint in this house. 2 would be, the other option is be depression. And this is more when, like, my husband is this. So it'd be more like, is there a cabin I can disappear to for quite some time? Like, is there a version of life where I just can like not come out? Some sort of covers I can go under. Like, it's just the idea that you want to turn the world off for a little bit. So one ways, like, interesting observation is that the need for tattoo artists have been at an all-time high the last couple of years. Mobile homes are hard to buy. Like, people are leaving their jobs, people are moving. There's just a lot of this in the world that you can see. Then again, with the combat soldiers, they have the acute emergency. Woohoo, we're all together. Regression phase, not so much. We're anxious or depressed. Then rebuilding. So this is what we are like hoping will happen for us, and assuming, just based on observing this pattern in other environments or other settings. We will adjust. This is what we as humans do. And in many ways, we could argue that we already have been proving our ability to adjust. Like, people are super, like, look at this, doing this presentation this way right now. This would be an example of us rebuilding and being like, work from home or work in the office. You choose. That kind of stuff is an element of us adapting. We are adapting to flux as a constant state. We are accepting things are going to be unpredictable. This isn't just a short-term bug in the system. It is our current reality, and it's almost more effort to resist it than it is just to be like, I guess this is how we're moving forward for now. This is called developing a flex mindset. So it's when we're finding people are at the most like maybe mental peace on this stuff. It's when they have accepted that even if the future looks different, we will return to a baseline level of subjective well-being, knowing that we don't have a lot of agency about a lot of what's going on. It really helps for people to be given the power to choose some things. So if you work somewhere where you are an employer, or have the ability to make this flexible for people, that can help, because we know that when people feel powerless about a lot, given the power to choose some things helps. Even if that is just how and when I return to work, or what ratio, if that's feasible, then it really helps people. We also have had the opportunity more than any other time in history to learn what has worked for us in terms of this, like remote work versus in-office work. And people are like generally quite good self-regulators. So letting people have the autonomy to take what they've learned and apply it. If they know, I work best in this setting, I work best taking doing yoga at my lunch break from home, like these kinds of things that people have incorporated into their lives are generally supporting productivity and outcomes for workplaces. So there's another interesting psychological concept called effective forecasting errors. It just means that when, as humans, we try to predict our emotions, like how we're going to feel about something, we are bad at it. So most of us assume, like they've done all these studies on this, we assume that when we're visualizing how happy something would make us, like how happy would I be if I won the lottery? How happy would I be if I got the promotion? How happy would I be if I get married? We assume we'll be happier than reality. So when we measure how happy people actually are, they were overestimating. But that's also true when we estimate how upset we'll be if something happens. So we tend to overestimate how distressed we'll be after a romantic breakup, if we were to lose a job, if we were to, if our sports team lost. It feels like it'll be more devastating most of the time in most scenarios than in reality. Our ability to handle it is better than we expect. I just think that's a nice little self-concept to keep tucked away in the old noggin, because I notice this in my life and my work all the time. It's like we just don't, we pin our future happiness in some imaginary place that never arrives. And we also spend so much time worrying about how bad something's going to be, when in reality, we make it, we get through. And it's not like it doesn't mean it's not, it could be awful, it could be horrific, it could be like the hardest thing we ever went through. But there is still some sort of, most of the time when we anticipate if it would destroy us, we're wrong. Like it, like certain losses in our life can feel, it's not that they wouldn't be devastating, but we are not great at estimating our own resiliency. In the context of the pandemic, we found that when, like, let's say all of a sudden the restrictions were lifted about, the various times that's happened, and it's like, you can be with people, go live your life cautiously distanced, but see people. Then there's this like, oh, I'm going to be so happy when that can happen. But then in reality, it sometimes has felt underwhelming and exhausting, like stimulation overload and then crash. And for some people whose identity has been very hinged on how important those really, like, it's almost like we don't recognize ourselves. So there can be an upsetting quality to not feeling how we expect to feel. And this can play out in different ways in the pandemic, but just a good thing to notice that when we have spent more time at home, we adapt to that quieter level of stimulus. When we aren't out in the world, we're not in traffic, we're not doing errands, we lower our threshold for it. So when things open and we start doing more of that, like if we worked from home 5 days a week and then all of a sudden tried to work at the office 5 days a week, it's going to be a huge exhaustion crash for most people. So it's best, if it's possible, to ease into that stuff, or at least anticipate, like, that's why I feel that way. It's not that anything's wrong with me. I just haven't adapted yet to this level of stimulus. And when things return to normal, sometimes we will mourn what we are losing. So I just think this is a really important thing for us all to be aware of, that like there have been perks of things, like people have realized some pros to having their life flipped, like all the rules flipped upside down. I know I've talked to people who've said all I've ever really wanted was for my family to go on a walk together after supper. And it's never happened until the world shut down and we didn't have to go to 10 million places. And if we realize how simple some of our actual joy can be and how free it can be, then we need to think about, is it still feasible to keep that in our life? Can we identify those things that made us feel that way? So if you are able to create policies that allow that flexibility in workplaces, that can help. If that means working from home, walking in the middle of the day, just balancing the reality of what people have learned, and that brings joy to their life, you're going to have happier, more fulfilled employees. The good news, as I was saying, with effective forecasting errors, we think we'll feel worse for longer than we really will. We assume people would be more depressed with all this, but actually it just, so far, it hasn't been the case. The numbers seem to be consistent to pre-pandemic levels, and suicide numbers have even been reported to be lower. So what this means is that we are more resilient than we realize, and we do possess a psychological immune system. We know some groups have been hit significantly harder than others. This has not been everyone's affected exactly the same way type of situation. It's like we're all in the same storm, different boats kind of metaphor, because people with young children are affected quite differently, especially women who've had to shoulder more of that sometimes, not always, but sometimes. And people have lost their jobs, and people have been impacted significantly by illness. Or if we've lost people close to us during all of this, that's also been very challenging. So we can acknowledge that. We can also acknowledge how resilient we have been, and know that we're active stewards of our own well-being. So in terms of how we can be an active steward of our own well-being at work, we can help our teams set clear goals and create visual progress trackers. I would talk about this, pandemic or no pandemic. This is so critical to people in terms of, like, the number one indicator of motivation is a sense of progress. So especially in times where our motivation is low, we want to make sure we have this in place. So I am going to show you some examples of those in a second, but I'm also going to tell you that having systems in place for more feedback is great. And sometimes this means self-requesting more feedback. It doesn't have to be like, not like report card style, but more just touch points, and not in a micromanaging way, but more in the like, people like to be told when they're on the right track about stuff. More than we underestimate how important that is. And recognizing micro progress is like, if I could just give put that in everybody's brain, I think people would feel so much better, because we just aren't great at subdividing tasks. I think of it like, okay, so when I was young, my dad told me this story about this wood pile that was at my grandfather's house. So my dad was little and he was with my grandpa, and they had this big pile of wood they had to chop for firewood. And the pile was so big that my dad thought, like, this is going to take us forever. Like, we better keep chopping if we're going to get this done. And my grandfather just kept saying, we'll just do a few a day, just like a few minutes every day, it'll get done. And so they did that for a week, just a few minutes, like 10 minutes. And the pile looked no smaller. And my dad was like, look, we've not made a dent. We're never going to get it done. Why are we not like working harder at this? And he said, just a little bit every day. We don't want to get ourselves too exhausted. And they kept it up and they kept it up. And after a few weeks, sure enough, they chopped all the wood. And usually when I tell that story live, people's reaction is like, and they're like, I know, it's anticlimactic. That is the point. That's the end of the story. They chopped the wood. Life is anticlimactic, like doing small, consistent steps towards our goals, not exciting, but effective. And I told my dad that story a few years ago. I was like, you know that story about the wood? He was like, nope, don't remember telling you that. And I was like, that fundamentally changed my life. He was like, well, fair enough. But like, if we can, not all of life is a wood pile. But the reason I love that story is because it's so concrete. And I just like apply it in my mind to less concrete situations, like an essay or a presentation or a report or a whatever. Like making something in my mind breakdownable helps. And so it's like every single time my dad showed up to chop some of that wood, the pile did get smaller. And logically, we know it's impossible that they wouldn't eventually finish it. Like, unless someone was secretly adding more wood, it's going to get smaller. But the reality is, of all work tasks, unless they're very, very tiny and discrete, most are big and abstract. You can't see your progress until you're like halfway. It feels like you're not making it in, and that stops people, because we like the idea of like, pile is done. Like that feels so good to us. And we hate the feeling of like, I worked and I see nothing, no results, nothing. And that prevents people from doing incremental progress. So all that to say, micro progress means figuring out if this task that I've written down as like one goal, like plan event or finish report for shareholders, like how can I subdivide that into 20 micro steps so that we can celebrate step 2 as much as we celebrate step 19, because that's when we get excited at that. When we finish it, we overvalue that last 5-10%. We're like, that's the day we feel great about ourselves. But why do we undervalue the first 90%? Why are they worth less when they're just the same amount of logs as any other section? So anyway, that's what I mean by that. Celebrate small wins to that end. Like, if we know what our micro progress is, we can celebrate wins along the way and not only at the end. And that doesn't have to be a party. I mean, who doesn't like Timbits? But it could be more like just acknowledging it and being like, woohoo, like we're making headway. So that sense of progress goes a long way. Using flex options, as we were chatting about. And it is worth acknowledging, I've worked with quite a few places where their main output is event-based. And events have been hit hard over the last few years, like sporting events, that kind of thing. It makes it really hard to plan. And then people get very discouraged because it feels like they're wasting their work if it feels like the rug could get pulled out from under them. and that has gotten pulled out in many cases. So when we break our goals into micro goals and see our progress more frequently, it takes some of the pressure off of the outcome. It means that we can still be happy along the way, no matter what ultimately happens with the outcome. And I think if the more creative and explicit we can get in how we define success, pandemic or no pandemic, this is true. Like maybe it isn't that event X happens as usual, but we could define our success more like 3 COVID scenarios were planned for, like building it in to measure ourselves based on the unpredictable reality. And a personal reframe that I like is like when I'm upset about like, oh, this thing can't happen how I wanted it to. Like I've got 2 weddings I'm in this summer, and it's all very much like, here we hope, fingers crossed, hope for the best. It's a lot that's like a bit uncertain. I can say to myself when I go into a little resistance mode or like, it's not fair, to say, I'm developing a flex mindset. How wonderful. That's something I need. It's intensive, free PD training in adaptability, flexible thinking, and creative problem solving. I know that's a stretch, but sometimes you need to take a stretch. And so it's just saying to ourselves, if nothing else, can I at least say that I'm putting some bank account like deposits into my skill set for being more adaptable, more flexible, and more creative. So here's an example of a visual progress chart. Many workplaces use these already. So great, keep doing it and use them more, use them for everything. Like having one, I think of it like a home base, kind of like it's like integrating information into one visual sphere is much easier for our brain to store. When information is spread out in too many places, it's again, because our brains like coherent narratives, we don't respond as well to that. So when we can see things synthesized, it adds to that element of progress and motivation and efficiency. So whatever you're working on, if there's a way of pulling just the key details into one visual organizer, where maybe in this case, it's like if you're all working towards something for the year, it could be writing out what the tasks are that contribute to that, who's the key point person or point people, a sense of the date to complete it by, if that's relevant, the status of it, and any notes. And this is also useful for future years, for future planning purposes, or if you weren't running the team anymore and someone else needed this, it would be really helpful data. And it's just a way of keeping people clear on also how they're part of a larger efforts, and how everyone, even if in their own little line item, they're feeling like they've only made 10% headway because it takes time. If they can see that other people have made 10% headway too, then collectively, there's more of this sense of momentum. And then individuals can do this too. They can do it on their own. They can have support to help do this, where it's like considering all your kind of different priorities or different types of functions of your role and the things that you're working on at a given time, and then creating a work back plan. Because this is, in terms of the whole procrastination thing that we see in humans, but also especially when times are stressful, creating sort of, it's like we're making urgency. We're adding urgency where it doesn't actually exist. Because if something's not due until mid-July, or let's say mid-August or whatever, we may think, I've got ages to do that. If it's like, let's say it's a month away. But if we start to map out what in an ideal world we'd be doing the week it's due, what would we be doing the week before that? What would we be doing the week before that? And what would we be doing this week? All of a sudden we're like, oh my gosh, I love my beautiful non-stressful plan. I guess I better do that thing this week and not put it off, because it creates urgency. And then you can do that and compare it across your tasks. So you have a clear sense of this week, these are my key priorities. This is just a way of doing visual progress mapping. There's a lot of ways to do it, but it's an idea. So to support productivity, allowing employees to have freedom to change up the environment throughout the day, or even just individually giving ourselves that permission to be like, how do I feel? Am I too cozy right now? Perhaps that's not helpful to me. Maybe I'm too uncomfortable. Maybe I need to be cozier. Maybe I'm too distracted. maybe I need to go work where there's people around. Maybe I need to work where there's no people around. Like allowing ourselves to, and encouraging this is really like benefits everybody. And also knowing things like just building that self-awareness that our morning needs are likely different than our afternoon needs. The type of work I can do in the morning is so different than the type of work I can do in the afternoon. Like my energy peaks so much now, like you're getting me at my most jazzy, but then like 3 o'clock onwards, whew, nope, it's not going to happen. So being allowed to go for walks, maintaining physical activity through the day. I'm sure that I'm not the first to say that to you. Like we know that in ourselves. We know that for everybody, it's going to create more focus, clear our head, help us get like move our body, move, like, what is the expression? Motion, create motion, move the emotion. Yeah. Like motion and emotion are interconnected. Booking and encouraging, modeling, even booking movement as an appointment with yourself, like in a calendar, and recognizing that like walking the talk or modeling that can help people give themselves that permission. So we still have such a culture around like looking lazy is such a fear, but I think that if we want to put into practice what we know to be true for ourselves and just like research wise, we have to encourage more movement and kind of model what we want to see, allowing for, or if you are at a physical workplace, if it's possible to bring someone in to do lunchtime workouts like a yoga class or create a walk club or any of those things is going to be better for employee, both like if we just think about the brain benefits in terms of focus and output and how much energy it can create, that's a benefit, but just the mental well-being, like the emotional regulation it creates, and then the sense of like fulfillment or of less irritation with your job if you feel like it also supports you in meeting your health in a more holistic way. Focused work blocks. This is something we're going to talk about from the rest of the presentation. It's a version of why we need to create work blocks for ourselves and supporting people in doing this. Like the meetings can make this tough depending how meetings are spread out in the day, but allowing people to know that it's beneficial to have even if it's a 1 hour focused work block where they can work and get ahead on some key priorities, this will make such a big difference where you're allowed to be kind of distractionless. Like maybe you're not allowed to turn off, I don't know, some people's roles are more emergency based, but if it's feasible to turn off email and phone distractions just for this work block, we know that leads to such deliberate, focused work, especially if someone has the self-awareness to put it at a time of day where they are best able to do that. And this would not always be a great use of time for emails, but more like, how do I get ahead on a project that I keep putting off because it's not on fire? Like it's not urgent, but I know it would be great if I could clear out some time and make some headway on it. Or it'd be like if you set a couple key priorities for yourself for the day to really move the needle in an important way, using that work block to do those tasks and not being a bit of a bull, like refusing to adapt. You know, that's extreme, but we know that affects people really positively. And even just trying it in your own life. And then if you're like, wow, that is effective, you might be doing it already. Is there a way to broadly help people understand the benefit and support them in doing it? Setting 1 to 3 key priorities a day is also a game changer. Now, this is where it gets tough because it depends exactly who I'm talking to and how to individualize this depending on your role. But in most cases, unless your role is entirely reactive, where you don't set any priorities for yourself, other people set them for you. If there's a part of your role that requires you autonomy or you to move forward on your priorities, then starting each day with a sense of what are those things I need to move the needle on today, and then not putting 7 or 8 things on that list, but like 1 to 3, depending how big they are, and then carving it, looking at your day and saying, where's the space to actually do this, and protecting that allows for that sort of sense of forward momentum instead of just reactive putting out fires energy. We also know it helps. This is the top tip I would give somebody who is feeling like they were having trouble getting started on something they know they should be doing, if they felt like they were avoiding it, I would say try setting a time goal instead of an outcome goal. Just like the wood pile example, sometimes when a task feels really big, our emotional brain is like, nope, I don't want to work on that because it's going to take me 8 hours. And so we don't do anything until we get to the deadline. And then we're like, better do it now because I'm much more stressed about not finishing it than finishing it. But that doesn't support us in making our life less stressful. So if we want to try this, all you need to do is set a time goal. And this is kind of the equivalent to the wood pile too, where it's like, let's just chop wood for 10 or 15 minutes, as opposed to let's finish 25% of the wood pile. That is ambiguous for our brain and stressful. And usually, if we haven't done the task before, we might find ourselves avoiding doing it at all. But a time-based goal can feel like manageable to our brain. And it can be anything from, I would say, 20 minutes to 45 minutes and not longer than that, somewhere in that range that your brain is like, that feels achievable. And your brain will say, I don't think I'll get anything valuable done in that time, but I guess I could do that without getting distracted. Don't worry about it. Your brain doesn't trust the system yet, but it will get something useful done, because the starting steps are always the most important, even if all it is like assessing what the actual project is, or reading last year's version, or going over your kind of outline in your mind, just diving in. We can't underestimate how important that step is. So I love doing time goals. And to support productivity, it's critical we take proper free time. This is like at the crux of so much of the work I do with people. It feels counterintuitive if we think we're underperforming, but we do need true division of rest and work, actual disconnection time. The cycle I see so often is that somebody will feel like they're burnt out or chronically exhausted and they're lacking motivation, and they'll say, help me be more motivated to get my work done. And I will say, all right, let's talk about it. And it'll usually turn out that they're working like kind of all the time, and not in a focused way, not always in an effective way. A lot of the time they feel like they're wasting time, but then they can't let themselves take a break because they're like, but I didn't do enough. So I feel guilty. So I can't take a break because I'm not a good employee. So I better work more. But then they work more, but then they're underperforming when they're working. And then they're exhausted because they haven't taken a break. Then they don't take a break because, you see, so we almost have to force the breaks so that when we are working, our brain has the brain power to be more focused. And then we have to be much more clear with ourselves on what we're trying to achieve, which is why those trackers can really help. We need vacation, even if we can't go on like big trips like we usually do. Just encouraging employees to take vacation, even if it's a home relaxation, off the clock vacation, and modeling this too. So time blocking. On average, people check their email 74 times a day. And this creates time confetti. This means that we are taking what could be meaningful moments of our lives and shredding it into tiny, useless pieces. And if we can intentionally carve out uninterrupted blocks of time as treasures to protect and use those for both deep work and deep fun, we feel so much better. This would be, I hope this is like a takeaway from today. And I'm sure it's not the first time. I didn't invent this by any stretch, but let me just reiterate, if you're already doing it, keep doing it. If you're not doing it or only doing it sometimes, like, let yourself protect this, because it makes such a big difference to our motivation level, our productivity level, and our sense of fulfillment and well-being. Do we allow ourselves time for deep fun, meaning uninterrupted, not distracted, whatever that looks like for us? Is it playing cards? Is it going for a swim? Is it whatever you love? Are you allowing just to carve out even half an hour for that experience without being pulled in other directions at the same time? Is it also possible to do that for work and allow ourselves to have the no interruptions? It doesn't have to be long. It's not like we need 4 hours. It's like, can we carve out some consistent blocks of time? So our brain also needs to know things aren't, if we only do this like once, our brain will not know how to use the time, because it'll be like, I'm wasting it. What if I never get this again? When will it's almost like it has to be almost every day for our brain to trust, like, and now I'm in this mode. It's the consistency that makes it matter. And what else helps us? So all of what I'm saying around things that can boost ourselves out of languishing, know that like we have to be careful about unrealistic expectations. It's not trying to like Pollyanna or be toxic positivity on you and be like, be happy, even though this is what's happening. It's more like we don't have to create a self-fulfilling prophecy. And there are things that help us, even when acknowledging the reality. So we can name it, like be honest about how we're feeling. We don't have to just diminish our own emotions. We can set ourselves a challenge to send 20 appreciation notes. This is like my number one strategy for just a boost to your own mental health. Just send 20 appreciation notes, texts, emails, whatever, where you just tell someone why you appreciate them. It makes their day, it makes your day. It's a great little exercise. Whenever you're feeling stuck, ask yourself, what advice would you give to a friend? Because we tend to be very wise for other people. Know that we have languished before. This is not the only time in your life if you're languishing, that you've ever languished. Like we can learn from our own past resilience and know that the strongest predictor of motivation is a sense of progress. So make ourselves explicitly aware of our progress and celebrate our small wins. And the last thing I want to talk about is flow. So we learned that during the early days of the pandemic, the best predictor of well-being wasn't optimism or mindfulness, it was flow. People who became immersed in their projects managed to avoid languishing and maintain their pre-pandemic happiness. So flow is just that. I think of it as that state of absorption, like the kind of time when you forget you're hungry, you forget you have to pee, or you're just so in the zone that you forget where you are. Knowing for yourself and for your employees what about their work puts them in that state is so important, because if people can tap into that in their workplace, everyone benefits. And that is, it's such a good self-awareness tool too, to know when do I feel that state? Am I doing that kind of work, at least a little bit every day? Mastery, mindfulness, and mattering are the components of flow. So in order to be in a flow state, we need to be doing something that's challenging. It can't be too easy. It has to require you to be a little bit challenged and also focus all of your attention on what you're doing. You can't be multitasking because it's challenging enough that you are all in, and it has to be something you care about, so you find it intrinsically motivating. So for me, like this, presenting, organizing stuff, getting to the bottom of people's feelings, playing cards with my family, playing piano, writing, these are all things that could do that for me. And it's important to ask yourself what would be on your list. And then if you manage people, understanding for them, what does that look like? Because it is such a powerful state to be able to know how to access in yourself. All right. So I'm just going to stop there, recap a bit, because I told you some extra stories. So languishing is the lack of mental wellness. It's hard to notice, but it's a general feeling of meh toward life. It's happening because we're collectively exhausted and we've been functioning in psychological survival mode for too long. We're entering our rebuilding phase, or maybe we're already in it. It's just when we are letting go of the resistance, accepting more of the flex mindset, and that helps us, and acknowledging that we can do things to strengthen our psychological immune systems, such as setting clear goals for ourselves and others, and recognizing micro progress and being as creative and playful with that as we can. It may have to be different than we've traditionally done it. Being able to celebrate small wins, leaving time, like creating that time blocking for ourselves, both for work and for fun, is such a life game changer. Knowing flow is the antidote for languishing. Like being able to access flow in our work and personally is critical in life. I think, again, pandemic or no pandemic, what a good thing to know how to do. And intentional rest and play sort of been a theme we've been talking about through all of this. And then ending with self-compassion. It's so easy for us to minimize when we're struggling. It's so easy for us to say, well, it's not really justified that I'm struggling, because like lots of people have it way, way worse than I do. But I think like Brene Brown always talks about how compassion is not a pizza, where it's like, if I give you some, then there's less for other people. Or if I give myself some, then there's not enough to go around. Like it's not it's a self-renewing resource. So the more that we practice compassion for ourselves, we actually deepen our ability to have compassion for other people. And I think when we have a compassion block internally, it does tend to show up in how in the limits to our compassion for others, because that judgment on ourselves comes out in some ways on judgment for others. So it's always beneficial to practice self-compassion, even though in our culture it is extremely unnatural and is something we have to practice intentionally. It just means being able to say to ourselves, like, even if it's just a tiny, tiny, minor disappointment, like, I am like, that hurts right now, that I'm in some pain. And then letting that be true. And then you're like, well, instead of trying to talk ourselves out of it, saying to ourselves, I think anybody in this position might feel similarly. Like, it's not wrong that I feel this way. It just is human. And then speaking to ourselves how we would speak to somebody who we love, like if we think of a child who we really love, or if we think of how someone might talk to us who we consider to be like the very, very compassionate presence, like what would they say? They wouldn't try and make you not feel it. They would probably say something like, I'm sorry you're in pain. Like, I'm not going to make the pain go away. I just want to acknowledge that it's happening and I'm here for you and I love you. Like, that kind of talk is so hard to give to ourselves, but wow, it allows us to release the grip on and move through the experience more easily. Okay, so I'll leave time just a couple minutes for questions. And I wanted to mention I'm running a group coaching program virtually in the fall. So if you're interested in that, you can contact me just on how, for anyone who's craving more calm in their life. I'm so happy to have been here today.
Thank you so much, Kaylee, for the great presentation again. It was really enjoyable. I hope everyone took away some great information from this today. You can also visit our website for more employer resources at hirefortalent.ca. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks for having me. Bye.